Good evening. This is Pastor Lew Burns from Abundant Life Baptist Church in our walk through the Bible study of Genesis and Genesis chapters 20 and 21 this evening. Where we left off last week, Sodom and Gomorrah and the surrounding area had been destroyed, and Lot had fled to the mountains with his two daughters. His daughters behaved badly. And on this time, after the destruction, chapter 20 begins in verse 1, and Abraham journeyed from thence toward the south country and dwelled between Kadesh and Shur and sojourned in Gerar. Now, this is territory that he was familiar with slightly. He had gone through this place. If we go back a few pages to Genesis chapter 16 and verse 1, Genesis 16 and verse 8, verse 16 and verse 7, I'm sorry, chapter 16 and verse 7. And the angel of the Lord found her by a fountain of water in the wilderness, by the fountain in the way to Shur. Now, this is Hagar. This is Hagar. Had been found when dismissed by Sarah, because Sarah had had no children, and she told Abram to go and to have a child with Hagar, her Egyptian maid. And then she was jealous and told Abram to dismiss Hagar and send her away. The angel found her there. This is going to become apparent. Why this is important will become apparent shortly. We go back to Genesis chapter 18 and verse 1. And the Lord appeared unto him in the plains of Mamre. He sat in the tent door in the heat of the day. Now, this is where he is leaving from, the plains of Mamre, and he's journeying on toward the south, in the south country between Kadesh and Shur in Gerar. In verse 2, Abram said of Sarah his wife, she is my sister. And Abimelech, king of Gerar, sent and took Sarah. He did not go and say to Abimelech, this is my wife. And this is, interestingly enough, Abraham is very old and Sarah's very old. She's 90. And he's still afraid that somebody is going to attack him so that they can have his wife. If we go back to if we go on to Genesis chapter 26 and verses 6 and 7, this is not an unusual thing. Abraham's son Isaac, later on, Isaac dwelt in Gerar, and the men of the place asked him of his wife, and he said, she is my sister. For he feared to say, she is my wife, lest, said he, the men of the place should kill me for Rebekah, because she was fair to look upon. So it seems to run in the family. Seems to run in the family. This deception, if you will, saying that their wife is actually their sister. But we'll come to see more about this. So Abimelech decided to have Sarah in his home and take him from Abraham. But here we are in verse 3. But God came to Abimelech in a dream by night and said to him, Behold, thou art but a dead man, for the woman which thou hast taken, for she is a man's wife. God is letting Abimelech know that this is not Abraham's sister, but in fact Abraham's wife, and God is not pleased with Abimelech for taking Abraham's wife unto himself. We go to the book of Job, chapter 33. Book of Job, chapter 33. And starting in verse 14, for God speaketh yea twice, yet man perceiveth it not. In a dream, in a vision of the night, when deep sleep falleth upon men, in slumberings upon the bed, then he openeth the ears of men and sealeth their instruction, that he may withdraw man from his purpose and hide pride from men. He keepeth back his soul from the pit, and his life from perishing by the sword. We go on to Psalm chapter 105, Psalm 105 and verse 4. Psalm 105 and verse 4. Seek the Lord and his strength. Seek his face evermore. Always look for what God would have you to do. Don't start making up your own mind and going off your own way. Seek the Lord's will for all things. Abimelech is protesting. He said, but Abimelech had not come near her. And he said, Lord, wilt thou slay also a righteous nation? He hadn't come near her yet. He just had her in his house. But Abimelech said, Lord, wilt thou slay also a righteous nation? Well, if we remember back in Genesis chapter 18 from last week, Genesis 18 and verse 23, where Abraham said, and Abraham drew near and said, wilt thou also destroy the righteous with the wicked? And he's speaking to God as well. Abraham had made the same plea for Lot and for Sodom and Gomorrah, for the righteous of Sodom and Gomorrah. And only Lot was found to be righteous. Lot and his wife and his daughters, because for Lot's sake. And they were let away. Here's Abimelech said, I didn't go near her. Lord, will you slay me for that? Said he not unto me, she is my sister, and she even herself said, he is my brother, in the integrity of my heart and innocency of my hands have I done this. I've done this. I didn't know. I didn't know Sarah was Abraham's wife. She said, he's my brother. So if we go on to 2 Kings chapter 20. 2 Kings and chapter 20. And verse 3. I beseech thee, O Lord, remember now how I have walked before thee in truth and with a perfect heart, and have done that which is good in thy sight. This is King Hezekiah, and Hezekiah wept sore. He's going to God and said, Lord, I've done what you've asked me to do. I've walked in thy way. Abimelech is pleading with God for his life and the lives of his kingdom. I'm sure he's heard of what happened in Sodom and Gomorrah. Verse 6, and God said unto him in a dream, Yea, I know that thou didst this in the integrity of thy heart, for I also withheld thee from sinning against me, therefore suffered I thee not to touch her. God intervened in the situation. God made sure that Abimelech was not able to sin in this when he took Abraham's wife, Sarah, into his house. If we go on to Genesis chapter 31 and verse 7, Genesis chapter 31 and verse 7, and your father hath deceived me and changed my wages 10 times, but God suffered him not to hurt me. This is what Jacob said of his father-in-law Laban, speaking that he tried to deceive me, he kept changing the deal, and yet God would not let him succeed. In Genesis 35 and chapter 5, Genesis 35 and chapter 5, and they journeyed, and the terror of God was upon the cities that were round about them, and they did not pursue after the sons of Jacob. They were not able to pursue Jacob and after his son. God intervened. The terror of God was upon the cities. Not going to mess with this, guys. God's hand is with them. Even further on, if we go to Exodus chapter 34, Exodus chapter 34 and verse 24, God speaking, for I will cast out the nations before thee and enlarge thy borders, neither shall any man desire thy land when thou shalt go up to appear before the Lord thy God thrice in the year. God is assuring the people that if they do what he's commanded them to do, to leave their houses and their lands, to go and worship him in the times that he requires, he will make sure that what they left, they will come back to. He is going to intervene against evil because the people are doing as they were told. We go on even onto 1 Samuel. 1 Samuel and chapter 25. 1 Samuel 25 and verse 26. Now therefore, my Lord, as the Lord liveth, and as thy soul liveth, seeing the Lord hath withholden thee from coming to shed blood, and from avenging thyself with thine own hand, now let thine enemies, and they that seek evil to my Lord, be as Nabal. This is Nabal's wife Abigail speaking to David, whose men were refused any hospitality, any food and water and things which were needed. And now his when Nabal refused, his wife Abigail gathered things and went to meet David. Said, "Now therefore my Lord, as the Lord liveth, seeing the Lord has withholden thee from coming to shed blood." He got stopped on the road before he did this thing. We go down to verse 34 in the same chapter, 1 Samuel 25. "For in every deed, as the Lord God of Israel liveth, which hath kept me back from hurting thee, except thou hast hasted and come to meet me, surely there had not been left unto Nabal by the morning light, any that pisseth against the wall." All of his men would have been killed by David, except the Lord had sent Nabal's wife with the supplies to meet David on the road. And David was withheld from doing that. So God is still speaking back here in Genesis chapter 20 and verse 7. "Now therefore restore the man his wife, for he is a prophet, and he shall pray for thee, and thou shalt live. And if thou restore her not, know that thou shalt surely die, thou and all that are thine." He is telling him very, very clearly, as he did in Genesis chapter 2 and verse 17. "Thou eatest of the fruit of the tree of good and evil, thou shalt surely die." Well, he's telling Abimelech here, you need to restore Sarah to Abraham. And again, if we go on to First Samuel chapter 7, we'll see another example. 1 Samuel chapter 7 and verse 5. "And Samuel said, Gather all Israel to Mizpah, and I will pray for you unto the Lord." Samuel is God's prophet, God's man in Israel. And he's saying very clearly, "Gather all Israel to Mizpah, and I will pray for you unto the Lord." I'm God's man here, and I will pray for you. I will raise up the prayers, and God will hear. And if we go, another example, perfect example, the book of Job, chapter 42. After all the trials, and after his three friends, supposed friends, have spoken against him, saying that he must have done something evil when he had not. In chapter 42 and verse 7, "And it was so that after the Lord had spoken these words unto Job, the Lord said to Eliphaz the Temanite, My wrath is kindled against thee, and against thy two friends, for ye have not spoken of me the thing that is right, as my servant Job hath. Therefore take unto you now 7 bullocks and 7 rams, and go to my servant Job, and offer up for yourselves the burnt offering. And my servant Job shall pray for you, for him will I accept, lest I deal with you after your folly, in that ye have not spoken of me the thing which is right, like my servant Job." Distinct difference between the man of God and those others who have done evil in the sight of the Lord. So here we are in verses 8 and 9. "Therefore Abimelech rose early in the morning and called all his servants and told all these things in their ears, and the men were sore afraid. And Abimelech called Abraham and said unto him, What hast thou done unto us? And what have I offended thee, that thou hast brought on me and on my kingdom a great sin? Thou hast done deeds unto me that ought not to be done." Abimelech he's beside himself. His men are beside themselves. God is going to kill them if they don't make peace with Abraham. He says to Abimelech, what thoughest thou that thou hast done this thing? If we go on to Joshua chapter 7, Joshua chapter 7 and verse 25. And Joshua said, why hast thou troubled us? The Lord shall trouble thee this day. He's speaking of Achan, who did against what the Lord had commanded Israel to do. And all Israel stoned him with stones and burned them with fire after they had stoned them with stones, Achan and all his family, because he took that which he was not supposed to take. As Abimelech took what he was not supposed to take, even though he did it innocently, whereas Achan knew what he was doing. But more on that at another night. Verse 11 of chapter 20 of Genesis says, Abraham said, because I thought surely the fear of God is not in this place, and they will slay me for my wife's sake. This is the same as we saw in Genesis chapter 12 and verse 12 in Pharaoh's Egypt. He had said the same thing, same result. Pharaoh was warned, restored Sarai to Abraham, as Abimelech is restoring Sarah to Abraham. We go on to Nehemiah chapter 5. Nehemiah chapter 5. And verse 15. He said, Nehemiah saying, but the former governors that had been before me were chargeable unto the people, and had taken of them bread and wine, beside 40 shekels of silver. Yea, even their servants bear rule over the people. But so did not I, because of the fear of the Lord. Nehemiah was God's man in that place, and he did what God would have him to do, not as the prior governors had done. If we go on to the book of Proverbs and chapter 16 and verse 6, Proverbs chapter 16 and verse 6, by mercy and truth, iniquity is purged. And by the fear of the Lord, men depart from evil. Abraham had said, surely the fear, I thought, surely the fear of God is not in this place. Well, obviously it is, because God gave Abimelech this dream. And so in verse 12 of Genesis chapter 20, and yet indeed she is my sister, she is the daughter of my father, but not the daughter of my mother, and she became my wife. You can read of this in Genesis chapter 11 and 29. So moving forward, let us go. She became my wife. And verse 13, and it came to pass when God caused me to wander from my father's house, that I said unto her, this is thy kindness which thou shalt show unto me in every place whither we shall come, say of me, he is my brother. Just in case somebody wanted to kill Abraham to get his wife. Just say, you're my sister. But this is not what God really wanted. Sarah, Sarai, called Sarah, was Abraham's wife. We go on to Hebrews chapter 11. Going back to Hebrews chapter 11 and verse 8. By faith, Abraham, when he's called to go out into a place which he should have to receive for an inheritance, obeyed, and he went out not knowing whither he went. I just told him to go and he went. And by faith, in verse 9, he sojourned in the land of promise, as in a strange country, dwelling in tabernacles with Isaac and Jacob, the heirs with him of the same promise. He wandered through Egypt. He came here to go on. So here we are, Abimelech in verse 14. Then Abimelech took sheep and oxen and men servants and women servants and gave them unto Abraham and restored him Sarah his wife. And Abimelech said, Behold, my land is before thee, dwell where it pleaseth thee. And unto Sarah he said, Behold, I have given thy brother 1,000 pieces of silver. Behold, he is to thee a covering of the eyes, unto all that are with thee, and with all other. Thus she was reproved. Abimelech is telling Sarah, God is with your husband. He's a covering of the eyes to all who perceive thee. All who want to have you cannot have you. You're Abraham. God has made it so. God has made it so. He's a covering. So in verse 17, so Abraham prayed unto God. All these things he's been given by Abimelech. So Abraham prayed unto God, and God healed Abimelech and his wife and his maidservants, and they bare children. God had already placed in verse 18, for the Lord had fast closed up all the wombs of the house of Abimelech because of Sarah, Abraham's wife. There wasn't going to be another child in all of Abimelech's household. But Abraham prayed unto God, and God healed Abimelech and his people. If we go on to Job, go back to Job, chapter 42. Job chapter 42, where we have Job, God telling Job's friends, have Job pray for you. Verse 9 in Job 42, so Eliphaz the Temanite and Bildad the Shuhite and Zophar the Naamathite went and did according as the Lord commanded them. The Lord also accepted Job. He accepted Job's prayers. He accepted the sacrifice. Pray for him. Same here with Abraham. Abraham prayed for Abimelech and his country. So on to chapter 21. On to Genesis chapter 21. And the Lord visited Sarah as he had said, and the Lord did unto Sarah as he had spoken. God had made a promise to Abraham that through Sarah, his wife, he would have a child. It was back in Genesis 17:19 through 21. God made a promise. He said, this is what's going to happen. By this time, in the time, she was beyond childbearing years. Abraham was old. But the God said, this is what's going to happen. And so it happened. So it happened. If we go to another example in 1 Samuel chapter 2, 1 Samuel chapter 2, and verse 21, a woman named Hannah, who had prayed at the temple before Eli, for she prayed to the Lord with all her heart, poured out her heart to God, and asked for a child. Well, here's the result in verse 21 of 1 Samuel 2. And the Lord visited Hannah so that she conceived and bare 3 sons and 2 daughters. And the child Samuel grew before the Lord. She had made a vow that if she would get just one son, just one child, Samuel, that Samuel would serve God all the days of his life. And once Samuel had been born and was weaned, she brought him to the temple to Eli, be raised up to serve God. And Samuel was God's servant all of his days. And what did God do? He rewarded Hannah. He visited Hannah so that she conceived and bare 3 sons and 2 daughters. And Samuel, and the child Samuel, grew before the Lord. Back to chapter 21 of Genesis. God keeps his promises, all of them, always. Verse 2, for Sarah conceived and bare Abraham a son in his old age, at the set time of which God had spoken to him. At that exact time where God spoke, God fulfilled what he had said to Abraham and Sarah. If we go to the book of Acts chapter 7, Acts chapter 7 and verse 8, Acts chapter 7 and verse 8, and he gave him the covenant of circumcision. And so Abraham begat Isaac and circumcised him the 8th day, and Isaac begat Jacob, and Jacob begat the 12 patriarchs, the beginning. He said, he's speaking of Abraham and his faith and what God told him to do, and he did it. And this is always what each of us should do. So in verse 3 of chapter 21 of Genesis, and Abraham called the name of his son that was born unto him, who Sarah bare unto him, Isaac. And Abraham circumcised his son Isaac, being 8 days old, as God had commanded him. Exactly as God had said to do, Abraham did. He had done it. The minute God said, circumcise everybody with you, including Ishmael, he did it. Didn't hesitate. Same day, did it. We saw that before in chapter 17, verses 10 through 12 of Genesis. But here in verse 5 of Genesis 21, Abraham was 100 years old when his son Isaac was born unto him. 100 years old. Verse 6. And Sarah said, God hath made me to laugh, so that all that hear will laugh with me. And she said, who would have said unto Abraham that Sarah could have given children suck? For I have borne him a son in his old age. The promise was there. The promise was given. The promise was fulfilled. And Isaac, through Isaac, will Abraham's seed be known. Verse 8. And the child grew and was weaned, and Abraham made a great feast the same day that Isaac was weaned. And Sarah saw the son of Hagar the Egyptian, which he had borne unto Abraham, mocking. Ishmael is a teenager by 13. And he's mocking his younger brother by Sarah, half brother. He's mocking. And that just couldn't be. Sarah couldn't have that. Sarah couldn't have that at all. Being mocked. We go back to Genesis chapter 4. Genesis chapter 4 and verse 29. Nope, can't be. Forget that verse. Verse 9. And Sarah saw the son mocking. Back to Genesis 14. Genesis chapter 14. Not it either. Genesis 21 and 10. Wherefore he said unto Abraham, cast out this bondwoman and her son, for the son of this bondwoman shall not be heir with my son, even with Isaac. Same jealousy she had had before when she cast Hagar away when she became with child. So now she's saying, cast out this bondwoman and her son. Throw them out. Get them out of the camp. Well, this was not. There was Abraham's wife. If we go on to Genesis chapter 25 and verse 6, Genesis chapter 25 and verse 6, but unto the sons of the concubines which Abraham had, Abraham gave gifts and sent them away from Isaac his son while he yet lived, eastward into the east country. Ishmael and other sons that he had after Isaac. Verse 11 of Genesis 21, 11 and 12. And the thing was very grievous in Abraham's sight because of his son. His son is 13 years old. He's lived with him. And God said unto Abraham, let it not be grievous in thy sight because of the lad and because of thy bondwoman. And in all that Sarah hath said unto thee, hearken unto her voice. For in Isaac shall thy seed be called. Listen to Sarah. I'll take care of everything else. In Isaac shall thy seed be called. Go to Romans chapter 9. Book of Romans, New Testament, chapter 9. Romans chapter 9 and verses 7 and 8. Neither because they are the seed of Abraham, they are all children. But in Isaac shall thy seed be called. That is, they which are the children of the flesh, these are not the children of God, but the children of the promise are counted for seed. The children of God's promise. We continue on to the book of Hebrews, chapter 11, and verse 18, of whom it was said that in Isaac shall thy seed be called. It's recounted again. From verse 13 of Genesis 21, and also the son of the bondwoman will I make a nation because he is thy seed. And Abraham rose up early in the morning and took bread and a bottle of water and gave it unto Hagar, putting it on her shoulder and the child, and sent her away. And she departed and wandered in the wilderness of Beersheba. She departed and wandered in the wilderness. Well, if we go to the book of Joshua chapter 8, Joshua chapter 8 and verse 35. There was not a word of all that Moses commanded which Joshua read not before all the congregation of Israel, with the women, the little ones, and the strangers that were conversant among them. Joshua made sure that all of this was read, that the children of Israel knew where they came from, through Isaac and Jacob and Abraham. But she wandered in Beersheba. The water was spent in the bottle, and she cast the child under one of the shrubs. And she went and sat her down over against him a good way off, as if it were a bow shot. For she said, let me not see the death of the child. And she sat over against him and lifted up her voice and wept. They're wandering through the desert. They had a certain amount of water. The water ran out. And in the desert, you don't go very far for very long. Over in Beersheba, without water. Verse 17. And God heard the voice of the lad, and the angel of God called unto Hagar out of heaven, and said unto her, what aileth thee, Hagar? Fear not, for God hath heard the voice of the lad where he is. Now, earlier in Genesis, we read where Hagar was promised. And Abraham was promised that God was going to take care of Israel. And here he's going to say, he's going to fulfill that which he had said. We go on. We go on to Exodus chapter 3 and verse 7. Exodus chapter 3 and verse 7. He's also speaking of another affliction. And the Lord said, I have surely seen the affliction of my people which are in Egypt, and have heard their cry by reason of their taskmasters, for I know their sorrow. God hears the cry of those who pray to him, who are in need. And he will hear, he will listen, and he will do what needs to be done. If we go to 2 Kings, 2 Kings chapter 13, 2 Kings chapter 13, in verse 4. And Jehoahaz besought the Lord, and the Lord hearkened unto him, for he saw the oppression of Israel, because the king of Syria oppressed them. And if we go down to verse 23 of 2 Kings 13, and the Lord was gracious unto them, and had compassion on them, and he had respect unto them because of his covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and would not destroy them, neither cast he from his presence as yet. As yet. So here, Hagar has been cast out. She's at the end of her rope. She's at the end of her water. God heard the voice. For God, he says unto the angel of God called to Hagar. Verse 18, arise, lift up the lad, and hold him in thine hand, for I will make him a great nation. He'd already promised this to Abraham. Verse 19, here's the key. And God opened her eyes, and she saw a well of water. And she went and filled the bottle with water and gave the lad drink. I find it very notable that there was this well there. Didn't say it was a fountain. Didn't say that it was a spring that sprang up out of the ground. It was a well. Someone had dug a well. She hadn't seen it. Neither had Ishmael seen it. God opened her eyes to where it was. She went and filled it. We go to the book of Numbers, chapter 22. Numbers, chapter 22, and verse 31. And the Lord opened the eyes of Balaam, and he saw the angel of the Lord standing in the way, and his sword drawn in his hand, and he bowed down his head and fell flat on his face. People's eyes are frequently closed to God's will and God's provision. It's right there in front of you, and you're so blind you can't see it. You can't see it. Spiritually blind. We go on to 2 Kings chapter 6. 2 Kings chapter 6. Verse 17. 2 Kings chapter 6, starting in verse 17. And Elisha prayed and said, Lord, I pray thee, open his eyes that he may see. And the Lord opened the eyes of the young man, and he saw, and behold, the mountain was full of horses and chariots of fire, round about Elisha. When they came down to him, Elisha prayed unto the Lord and said, Smite this people, I pray thee, with blindness. And he smote them with blindness according to the word of Elisha. We drop down to verse 20. And it came to pass, when they were come into Samaria, that Elisha said, Lord, open the eyes of these men, that they may see. And the Lord opened their eyes, and they saw, and beheld, and behold, they were in the midst of Samaria. God opens eyes, and he closes eyes so that people can see. So here we have Esau, verse 20. And this is, and God was with the lad, and he grew and dwelt in the wilderness, and became an archer. And he dwelt in the wilderness of Paran, and his mother took him a wife out of the land of Egypt. She went back to her own people. She was an Egyptian. She took Ishmael, a wife, out of Egypt. So Ishmael is becoming a nation, as God had said. Verse 22, and it came to pass at that time that Abimelech and Phicol, the chief captain of his host, spake unto Abraham, saying, God is with thee in all that thou doest. Well, they've recognized this from back in first chapter 20 and verse 2. God is with thee in all that thou doest. Now therefore swear unto me here by God that thou wilt not deal falsely with me, nor with my son, nor with my son's son, but according to the kindness that I have done unto thee, thou shalt do unto me and to the land wherein thou hast sojourned. And Abraham said, I will swear. He is looking for. Go on to Genesis chapter 26. Genesis chapter 26 and verse 26. Then Abimelech went to him from Gerar, and Azaheth, one of his friends, and Phicol, the chief of the army. And Isaac said unto them, Wherefore come ye to me, seeing ye hate me, and have sent me away from you? Well, here we have it again. And they said, We saw certainly that the Lord was with thee. And we said, Let there now be an oath betwixt us, even betwixt us and thee, and let us make a covenant with thee. We go on to Isaiah chapter 8. Isaiah chapter 8 and verse 10. Isaiah chapter 8 and verse 10. Take counsel together, and it shall come to naught. Speak the word, and it shall not stand. Why? For God is with us. God is with us. As God is with us, his children. We go on to Joshua chapter 2. Joshua chapter 2 and verse 12. Now therefore I pray you, swear unto me by the Lord, since I have showed you kindness, that ye will also show kindness unto my father's house, and give me a true token. This is the sign that Joshua sent into Jericho. Swear to me by the Lord. I've showed you kindness. I'm helping you here in Jericho. Swear that you will show kindness. And if we go on to 1 Samuel 24, 1 Samuel 24 and verse 21. Swear now therefore unto me by the Lord that thou wilt not cut off my seed after me, and that thou wilt not destroy my name out of my father's house. David was being besieged by Saul. Covenants, promises. God always keeps his promise. Abraham swore unto Abimelech, and Abraham reproved Abimelech because of a well of water, verse 25. But the Abimelech's servants had violently taken away. And Abimelech said, I want not who hath done this thing, neither didst thou tell me, neither yet heard I of it, but today. And Abraham took the sheep and oxen and gave them unto Abimelech, and both of them made a covenant. They made a covenant one with the other. And Abraham set 7 ewe lambs of the flock by themselves. And Abimelech said unto Abraham, what mean these 7 ewe lambs which thou hast set by themselves? And he said, for these 7 ewe lambs shalt thou take of my hand, that they may be a witness unto me that I have digged this well. Your servant, this is my well. This is a witness of the covenant between us. This is, if we go on to Genesis chapter 31, Genesis chapter 31. In verse 48. And Laban said, this heap is a witness between me and thee this day. Therefore was the name of it called Gilead. A bunch of stones, this heap of stones. We go on to verse 52. This heap be a witness, and this pillar be witness, that I will not pass over this heap to thee, and if thou shalt not pass over this heap and this pillar unto me for home. You go your way, I'll go my way. This is the dividing line. Neither one of us will break this oath, this covenant. So here, in verse 31, Abraham has made a covenant with the Lord about this well. But verse 31, wherefore he called that place Beersheba, because there they swear both of them. Thus they made a covenant at Beersheba. Then Abimelech rose up and took all the chief captain of his house, and they returned unto the land of the Philistines. They returned unto the land of the Philistines. If we go to the book of Joshua, chapter 13 and verse 2. This is the land that yet remaineth, all the borders of the Philistines, and all the people from Abimelech. Verse 33, and Abraham planted a grove in Beersheba, and called thereon on the name of the Lord, the everlasting God, and Abraham sojourned in the Philistines' land many days. Abraham and all of his flocks and Isaac, they sojourned in the land of the Philistines and were given peace in the land of the Philistines. They're recognizing God was with Abraham. That concludes our lessons for tonight, our sojourn in Genesis 20 and 21. May God be with you all and bless you. I pray that this has been a blessing and that you will return next week to hear more in our walk through the Bible in the book of Genesis. Have a blessed night